Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Talking Sugar, the live stream talk show where we celebrate and nerd out about the things that we love. I'm Sparrow, your hardworking Tanuki gamer mom, and tonight we are talking sugar all about writing fantasy. If you don't know, I have a side hustle writing queer romantic fantasy fiction under the pen name Evelynn Carver. I am still a baby author with only 2 officially published works to my name, but joining me tonight is veteran author and editor Jamie Beth J.B. Garner. JB has written over 20 novels across multiple genres and edited hundreds more. She's seen and done many things in her life, from being an honor student to a factory worker to a garbage collector and construction worker. She's an avid gamer, particularly Pathfinder and Final Fantasy XIV. That's where I know her from. And an enjoyer of comic books, anime, and movies of all stripes. She guest exhibits and panels at cons across the U.S., large and small, fueled by a love of fandoms and a desire to connect with readers and fans. And through it all, her true passion has always been the written word. She writes fantasy, sci-fi, pro wrestling epics, among other things, and is always out to entertain and amaze. So let's introduce her. Welcome to Talking Sugar, JB.
Well, thank you for having me, Sparrow. I really appreciate being here. I don't really need to introduce much else. Sparrow did a fantastic job. But yes, I'm JB Garner. My friends call me Jamie, and she, her pronouns, and I write and do things, and we're talking fantasy tonight. We're talking shop, which is like my favorite thing to do in the world. So we're gonna have a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah, we definitely are. Like, I was talking a little bit while we were doing our setup about, like, I don't get to talk about this topic like in real life, like using my voice. I'm in lots of Discord communities where, we chat, but it's very exciting for me to have another author on to talk about this live, and especially on this stream, which is about talking about nerdy things that we love. So I'm really excited to get into it. So let's just jump in. I have a rough outline for our discussion. We'll see where it goes.
We'll take it interesting places.
So first off, I just wanted to flash some of JB's works. I grabbed some of her cover art from her website, and look at these great covers. And you write lots of different genres, is that right?
Yes, I apparently have a lot of voices trapped in my head, and I've got to get them out somehow. So, this is a sample of what, and fantasy. I've got middle grade fantasy, adult fantasy. I did a whole pro wrestling series, which is actually what got me in contact with Randy Milholland, who we have at least one person that was sent here from Randy, who's a very good friend of mine. And what I've got coming out right now, Indomitable is a superhero epic. It's the first book. It comes out, actually, it's on pre-order. It comes out April 30th. As the graphic actually says. Yeah. So, yes, I kind of go where the passion and the muse takes me. Sometimes it's a good place. Well, it's always a good place, but sometimes it's a good place for my pocketbook, and sometimes it's not, but it doesn't matter. It's the passion of writing that really keeps me going in general.
I hear that. I definitely hear that. Getting into the publishing field at all is challenging.
Oh, yeah.
Do you primarily do you work with a publisher, or do you self-publish these books?
I started off as an indie writer, self-publishing. I still do a fair bit of that, but my current stuff, like Indomitable and the other 2 books I have coming out later this year, are all through a publisher. I've worked with small publishers in the past, and I'm really happy working with my new publisher, Ginger Blue Publishing. They're the first publishers that paid me in advance, so they're automatically ahead of the game.
Yeah, for real.
It's not a huge advance, but it's an advance.
An advance is an advance. That is rare nowadays, especially for smaller indie publishers.
It really is. And I mean, it's even rare for the traditional publishers these days. So that's saying a lot.
Yeah, for real. I also work with a small indie publisher, and I did not get an advance. Though I do get generous royalties compared to some others, but still.
That's good. It's still good. That's very good business. Like, I mean, so yeah, no, thumbs up. Good job.
So I know you mentioned hooray for real bucks, not just for exposure bucks. Indeed.
Indeed.
So how long have you been working with the publisher? Is it just the new for this book that's coming out?
Yes, this is my first book with them. I basically got like kind of sent their way by a traditionally published friend of mine who like read one of my books. Like, I think you've really got something here. You should actually, try talking to this publisher that I know. And then kind of negotiations, getting to know people, and then they picked me up end of last year. So this is my first official year with them. So Indomitable's my first book with them. Next I've got coming up Songs and Sorcery. It's a epic fantasy. I don't unfortunately have cover art for that yet. Oh. It's an epic fantasy murder mystery.
Ooh.
And then I've got at the end of the year, I'll be putting out A Figment of My Imagination, which is an first book of like an urban fantasy comedy series.
Wow. So you've got a lot going on.
Yes.
We have a question from chat from Henry. He asks, who do you get to review your writing for improvement, and what's been the best suggestion that you've ever acted on?
Okay, well, I'll take it first, and then I also want to hear your answer too, Sparrow.
Sure.
That's the whole point. We are discussing, and we are both authors. So who do I get to review my writing? So I do a couple of different steps. I am actually part of I'm from Chicago. We have there's a local writing critique group that I'm a part of, so they help. They read a lot of my stuff and give feedback and suggestions. I, on top of that, have a little network of other writer friends that I bounce stuff off of. Then there's the beta readers. So I try to get I don't have a great beta read team, but I do. Well, they're great, but I don't have many. But I try to collect as many people as I can to have readers to read at it. But most importantly, editors.
Yes,
editors are important. Speaking
extremely.
This isn't just me trying to pimp my own editing business. It truly is. However, the best suggestion I ever acted on. So this one's a fun one. So my wrestling series, 3 Seconds to Legend, Opening Bell's the first book. I actually first started kind of building readers by posting on DeviantArt of all places.
Oh wow!
Chapter by chapter. Yeah, that's how
DeviantArt.
Yes, that was years and years ago. This is 6 years ago. And the best suggestion I ever acted on is I did the first chapter, and I meant one of the characters to be a throwaway antagonist, just there to be an initial challenge for the protagonist and to help set the stage. But then one of the readers, because I got a couple of actually really avid fans then, and I got an email, I got a message hey, I read that, and they just started fan theorizing on this throwaway antagonist.
Oh wow.
And that made me realize that I can't. That character's too good to throw away. They are actually they went from throwaway antagonist to secondary deuteragonist of the story. She became one of the two main protagonists of the entire series.
That's amazing, and from ideas from your fans.
Yeah, and it was a great idea, and it made the series so much better. Otherwise, it would have been okay, but it would have been kind of a one and done. It really wouldn't have developed into a trilogy that had heart, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's so cool. Speaking from my perspective, I also have a small group of beta readers that I use. I found some of them just using, Discord groups, but some of them are my real life friends, which was kind of a big step for me because I've been writing for years and years, but I was extremely shy about it.
I understand.
Literally terrified of sharing it with people in my real life. Because I started actually writing fan fiction when I was very young, like a middle schooler, and have been posting on and off, on sites like fanfiction.net and AO3 for like 20 years. So it was kind of a really big deal for me to kind of step away from that level of anonymity and show it to real people in my life instead of strangers on the internet.
I could totally get that. That is a huge step.
But it's really helped me grow as a writer. It was terrifying, but being able to share that with not just people online, but people that I trust and who are kind and gentle, but also honest with me about things.
Honesty.
Yes.
Honesty's important. Honesty's real important.
It's extremely important. And I'm also very lucky to have an excellent editor at my publisher. There are things I don't like about my publisher, but one of them is definitely not my editor. She is amazing, and she has made my writing so much better. So shout outs to Elizabeth at 9 Star Press. But let's see. So let's kind of jump in to some of our discussion topics for tonight. The first kind of like section I have is just us talking about the essence of fantasy. Like, what does fantasy mean to you? What were your influences as a fantasy writer? I know the both of us have a lot of things in common in that we are lovers of anime, lovers of movies, of fantasy books. But JB, tell us a little bit about some of your influences.
Well, I know I'm going to forget some, but because the thing is, like, almost everything you take in as an influence, but big ones. But we're going to know the big ones. Literary wise, even though it's somewhat fantasy. Stephen King is just one of those huge literary influence. I devoured so much Stephen King when I was so much Stephen King when I was in high school and middle school, and there's a lot of things he's also written some really good things about writing the process itself.
Yeah.
And I mean, no writing text is ever perfect because every writer has their own process, but still it's a lot of good stuff. And I learned a lot of good things from Stephen King. Also when I was young, Robin McKinley, who you don't hear about much these days, the Blue Sword, the Hero, and the Crown, the Damra series, definitely kind of opened my eyes to fantasy, and fantasy with that fantasy that can have female protagonists and not be princesses and the like.
Yeah.
Which, that's, the egg was only cracking when I was young, but the egg would eventually hatch. And I say probably the big one we talked to, probably with bigger name fantasy that most people would recognize. For me, it wasn't Lord of the Rings. It was David and Lee Eddings, the Belgariad, Malloreon, and then the follow-up novels like Belgariad the Sorcerer and Polgar the Sorceress. That was like my first real touch of epic fantasy that doesn't, because I'm going to say blasphemy.
Uh-oh.
I never have managed to get through the Lord of the Rings.
Guess what? I haven't either.
Yes, we are blasphemers together.
We are.
The Hobbit, I love.
We're gonna get canceled.
Lord of the Rings is like. Yes, Reku is with us as blasphemers. Now,
how dare we?
Now, at the same time, I'm going to say this. Well, I couldn't get through it. I can appreciate the influence and the importance of it. This is not for a book for me. But the Belgariad and the Malloreon has a lot of that same epic, broad, majestic scale of the Lord of the Rings, but I felt I could connect to the characters, had more of a less travelogue and history book, and more like an actual adventure. Which is not to say the Lord of the Rings doesn't have an adventure before I'm pilloried, but it's the presentation, right? It's always in the presentation.
And I have to say, I love these old school, kind of sword and sorcery, illustrated covers.
Wow,
Oh,
chef's kiss.
they're so good. I miss them so much. I want to go back to these days.
Yes,
They're
I
so
do.
fun.
That's why I like the cover for like Goddess Tier, like that one book. I was given that cover, and I was like, and I built the book around the cover, honestly. But the cover was just straight that striking painted style, and you're like,
Yeah.
I
So
could
beautiful.
turn a picture into a story. Obviously, like gaming wise, like we talked about Final Fantasy 14. We talked about, you already mentioned Final Fantasy 14, Pathfinder,
Yes.
D&D. Those are just huge game influences. I mean, you just can't not. Anime, God, I'm gonna say, yeah, the big anime like you have. Obviously, like I don't know if this property's ever made a resurgence, but it still gets talked about today. Record of Lotus War.
Yep.
Which is, if I understand, was literally someone taking their D&D campaign and making it a light novel, then an anime series, but like.
Well, me and my partner were actually talking about this because I'm a fan of Lodos, but he is a huge super fan of Lodos. And, he was talking about this and the origins of Lodos, how you could originally apparently just buy transcripts of them playing the game, because this was originally like a tabletop game called, oh my God.
When it comes to fantasy, like we talked about, like I'm doing urban fantasy like at the end of the year. Anime wise, I'll have to say, and this is not even a guilty pleasure. This is like my feel good series to go back to, and I ever want to feel good. But it is also like it does have some of the humor and heart I'm trying to capture in the urban fantasy, right? Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid.
Oh yeah.
Helps that it's queer.
That always helps, in my opinion.
Yes, yes. I am so gay. But yeah, it's as far as the series I'm working on, it has an element of like the normal. I tried to capture some of those elements. I'm trying to capture those elements of like having a bit of that, embracing some of that like modern normal life. There's a better word for it, but like as the normalcy of things, while also embracing the weird and the magical. That in the modern world,
magical realism, or what do they call it? Yeah,
something like that. There's probably some fancy
you're in the real world, but there's these magical elements.
Yes, mundanity.
Yes.
Oh, hey, we have a question.
Oh yes, Henry asks, where do you set the dial between one breakout fantasy item or a character in an otherwise mundane world versus a fully realized fantasy world where the reader can anticipate the fantasy elements and are deeply integrated into the economy around the characters? Wow, great question, Henry.
That is a deep question. I like it. The great thing about that dial is there's so many settings you can do. Because you can go anywhere from, as you said, you could do like just a totally normal world that has one weird thing, and then any cascading effects from that one weird thing, which is in essence what like Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid is. It's totally normal world, but like a dragon or two gets in.
Yeah.
More dragons follow, but that's the only thing that's weird. Now they're very weird, but it's the only thing. But then you can notch up between like a lot of classic urban fantasy has like the shadow world where like there's fairies and elves, but they live in secret amongst us. And you can keep cranking all the way. I think the important thing, all the way up to like the epic fantasy, like your full on epic fantasy world. I think the big thing to remember, wherever you set that dial, make sure to stick to that setting. Like, keep the consistency. You can maybe notch up over time, but like in a single book, I would say you may notch up over a series, but that one book, keep consistent. Like, if you got the one thing, stick to the one thing. If you're doing a whole big fantasy thing, don't just. Well, then you're already full gear, so there's really nothing else to dial down. You can't really go backwards. That's actually, what that's the big important thing. You can only if you once you set that dial, you can only add more fantasy. You can't take it out.
Yeah, I think that's
just weird to take it out.
Yeah, I think that would kind of like your readers would almost feel like betrayed a little bit if you suddenly decided you're just going to be full on everything super realistic versus a fantasy world, or vice versa. You don't want anyone to be like shocked by some convention just being completely broken necessarily. For me, I write primarily, second world fantasy. I don't write as much contemporary, though I am thinking I have kind of like an outline of a story of contemporary romance, but I haven't really mixed the genres that much. Though I love certain aspects of isekai, the second world fantasy kind of like anime where a character is like pulled into another world. That was a big part of my influence growing up. Here we have Escaflowne, which is like one of the original isekai where a girl gets sent to another world. Back when all those were shoujo, unlike nowadays where it's all kind of the opposite. But
I hadn't even thought about that. They were all shoujo back in the day. We just dropped.
Yeah, it was Escaflowne, it was Fushigi Yugi, it was Ray Earth. There's like all these anime where they go to a different world back when they
Inuyasha?
Inuyasha, yeah, exactly. And now it's all like they're in a video game and they're harems, but to each their own.
hey, that influence wise, I did forget to mention. I guess we're bringing it back, girls. Very modern show that I have definitely gotten influenced by and am very enamored with is it's one of those really long light novel names.
Yes.
The Magical Revolution of the Reincarnated Princess and the Genius Young Lady. If you want, it's interesting because I've never really watched a reincarnation style show. The reincarnation isekai, which is I've seen around, and it was really well done. Really caught my attention. Again, it's not only it is Yuri, but it is Yuri that actually gets consummated.
Oh, nice.
Which is good.
Yeah, I think that's kind of unusual for the genre, unfortunately, right?
Very much is. I mean, a lot of that is due to how I know Japan's still real weird about LGBT stuff. Real weird. But no, yeah, it actually ends with. But it does do a lot of the stuff with the isekai and the and having a character that has memories of their past life in modern Japan and is using them, but not in like the crazy way. Sometimes a lot of modern isekai goes from like zero to insane in like one episode. And again, a good, properly consummated relationship, always a plus for me. But yeah, it's isekai. It's isekai like that is back to being a bit shoujo-y.
But yeah, that sounds like really fun. I'm a big fan of anime in general, and I'm so excited that there's so many new fantasy anime coming out nowadays. I'm a big fan of Frieren and Delicious in Dungeon, which are airing now. Those are excellent fantasy anime. And like speaking of other influences, I know both of us are big gamers. I know you've talked about Final Fantasy, particularly Final Fantasy 14 being a big influence.
Chef's kiss.
Wait
for summer.
How long have you been playing?
Less than most people think. So I was a big MMO junkie. Back in, I kind of got sucked in with EverQuest. Oh my god!
Oh wow!
and then kind of WoW. There's a few after EverQuest started to go downhill, and then World of Warcraft, of course, like so many other people. And then a little Final Fantasy 11, but would eventually did 14 background Heavensward, and Heavensward was new, but just for a little bit. I really liked it, but the circumstances couldn't really play. Life got in the way. And then, just a couple of, I think it's been maybe about 3 years now. Some good friends of mine who were playing it finally convinced me to get back in because I was like, no, if I do another MMO, I'll lose all my time. I have so much work to do. And they eventually convinced me this is worth it. And I did, and I have been hooked ever since. Because it just does such a great job storytelling. It's a fun game that does an amazing job with storytelling. first MMO I played that really did that. A lot of MMOs had stories, but you were not well integrated into it as a player. The stories happened around your character, not with your character, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that agency is what really can suck you into it so much. Ultimately your choices don't technically change the story.
but it makes you feel like you have an impact.
Right. And sometimes they do in like subtle ways. I especially like how the game remembers what you've done, even if it's optional side content.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't radically change the course of the story, but it adds a lot of flavor and nuance when instead of like a couple of people are, there at this major story quest, like everybody's there. Like everybody that you've met, representatives of like every faction, everyone you've helped out along the way, because you did all the content is there, and it makes it feel so much more real. Like, you have consequences, which is important to writing.
And Reku says what she's not saying is she's also had tank stance on the entire time.
It's not my fault. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. I do my best. It's not my fault.
I also love Final Fantasy XIV. I have been playing off and on for about 10 years, but I haven't been consistently playing that time. I had to take a big break when my son was born, and I really only came back right before Endwalker came out, but I actually started playing with the Final Fantasy XIV beta before Realm Reborn. I guess, and very briefly, my computer could not handle it. and I came back when Heavensward came out, similar to you, and played for a while. Got up to around Stormblood, then I had to take a long break because we lived internationally for a while, and then I had a child, and I just did not have time to play again. But Booby Trap is in chat. Cheering you on.
Yeah.
But I love this game just because of, like, it has so much character. It has so much style. I love animal characters, as you might have guessed based off of this. So I love the Mikote. I love the Fiera. I love all the animal characters. And just in general,
I'm going Cat and Dawn Trail,
Oh, yeah. The Proth Gals. Are here. I'm very excited for that as well. It's in Dawn Trail coming out this summer. And I just love the character writing specifically. The plot writing is excellent as well, but like you feel so like close to the side characters in this game. Like, I don't know, it's just really compelling, and one of my favorite things to play, even as like a single player experience. I love playing with friends as well, but the way they've kind of integrated a single player experience as well into the game is really great for people who aren't as MMO savvy like myself. Yeah. I primarily play single player games, but I'm having a blast, and I'm really excited for Dawn Trail coming out this summer.
I think we did a question.
Yes, let's see. Henry has another question for us. So have the automated interpolation generated knockoff books forced you off of the shelf publishing platforms such as Kindle? And if so, have you marketed your talents to human publishers?
I really like how he put AI.
Yes.
And did not...
Automated interpolation. That's being very generous, I think.
It's also way more accurate than saying artificial intelligence.
Yes, that's very true. I've heard it called plagiarism machines.
That's also very accurate.
Yeah. Whoa. Thank you, everyone, for gifting those subs, J Payne. I really appreciate it. That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
So how has AI affected you as a writer?
Okay, yeah, that's actually a really good question. So far, it hasn't affected me that much. However, I keep an eye on the industry, and there is a rise. Like, it is. We all originally thought, like, in the publishing biz, that like Amazon would let AI kind of play around, and then they would like lock that stuff down hard.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they have not. They will ask you, "Oh, is this?" There is now when you put a book on Amazon, they actually ask, "Does this have AI content?" But it's not to stop you. It's just we're just curious.
Yeah.
And honestly, AI has kind of run pretty rampant. But fortunately, at the same time, it's also kind of proven its limitations.
Mm-hmm.
There are people that like will read AI books, but most people like they don't do well. Like it's very obvious.
It's very obvious.
Feels nasty, not very satisfying. So I think we're currently as writers we're pretty safe, but it keeps getting better, so it is a little frightening.
Yeah, it is.
What it really hurts is the artists.
Yes, as I can speak to that a little bit. I am, in my day job, I am an artist. I'm a graphic designer and illustrator for a consulting firm. And, that's how I fund my hobbies, including writing, which is kind of like my side hustle. It does not pay the bills for me yet. But as far as AI art goes, it is kind of terrifying because a lot of our customers are asking for it. So unfortunately, I've had to learn to use some of the tools because that's what people are demanding. But I try to make sure I'm using them ethically. We only use AI generated images from a data set which has been verified, meaning that the artists and the designers that they're pulling the data set from have consented and received compensation for the work that is being pulled from their work. And that's very important to me. That is a huge ethical, moral standpoint that I will not cross, and a huge issue with some of the tools right now because artists, writers, photographers, designers are having their work pulled without their consent, without proper licensing, without any sort of copyright, or I should say with full copyright infringement. And I'm very curious in the next couple of years how some lawsuits are going to shake out. I will say that. It's kind of a hard line to tread right now in the tech world in general, because it's such a buzzword everywhere. It's we have another question here from Henry. Is anybody else tempted to make a villain more obvious because it has an inconsistent number of fingers?
I'm looking for the six-fingered man.
Exactly.
That would be funny. That'd be funny. To add one more quick thing about the AI, though, one upside, at least with artists, is that at least, I of course truck nothing in AI. I literally quit a very lucrative job because of AI recently.
Wow.
That's why I'm freelance again. But
wow, good for you.
there are, if you do, I think this is a trend that will die like Bitcoin.
I hope so.
And
I wish I could be as optimistic as you.
I've just seen a lot. And it is optimistic. Yeah. I will agree, but I've seen enough that I've seen enough where because it's never going to be able to get full creativity. So I don't think
it's not. Yeah, it will never fully replace the ingenuity and creativity of real human beings. Either in writing or
the initial few lawsuits that like the stuff that you're talking about, the initial few have kind of gone on our side. So fingers crossed.
Exactly.
Fingers crossed.
So, we'll see. AI killed my father. Prepare to die.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
So kind of speaking on that kind of topic, we talked a little bit about our influences. Ooh, we've got a hype train going. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about world building. And we kind of talked a little bit about this. Thanks to Henry, he talked about, or he asked about modern settings versus, full-on fantasy settings. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, like, how do you do your world building? Where do you come up with your ideas? And how do you use any, like, particular tools to help you create your worlds?
Okay, that's a good question. I love talking world building, especially. So, world building is interesting. How I generally go about it, so, tools. Let's do the easy parts of it because, like, before we get really into the weeds, tools. Well, I will say one thing I've started to get a use out of because fantasy usually requires maps.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're doing brand new worlds, people interpret worlds through maps, and plus they're really nice to have at the front of your fantasy novel. They look all nice.
I love fantasy maps. It's one of my
Everybody loves a
favorite things
fantasy map.
about physical books, fantasy books, is that beautiful map at the beginning. I wish I could draw maps. I cannot.
So, I can give you a really great tool if you want to make cool-looking fantasy maps to put in your books.
I do. Tell me more.
Incarnate. You know what? I'll give you the website. I'll put it in chat.
Incarnate.
Incarnate. It is actually the tools that are being used. Like, I can't, unfortunately, because things have not been 100% approved through the publisher's art department and everything. Like,
oh, sorry.
I can't show can't show the maps I have done with Incarnate for my upcoming fantasy novel. But if you look at the website, they do. It's amazing. It's also surprisingly easy to use, which is the thing that always got me. I mess with a lot of art programs and a lot of, like, specifically map programs, but none of them have kind of gotten the quality level plus the ease of use that I did of Incarnate. So,
neat.
Highly recommend.
I will have to check that out.
Because highly recommend.
I can do character art. I can do, that sort of thing, but I cannot do maps for whatever reason. They always end up looking bonkers. Or just not as neat or nice or professional as I would like. So I will definitely check that out. Thank you for the tip.
Yeah, highly recommend to anyone in that situation. Otherwise, I am a little old school in how I organize my information. I'm not so archaic as to use, like, pen and paper, mainly because of the arthritis, and because I have kind of a little bit of arthritis in my hands. I can't write for too long. But I generally just kind of, like, start making notes in documents and then start riffing on things. But when it comes to so that is very kind of old school. But there are some really good other tools and programs out there. I would definitely dig into Scrivener, and a couple other ones are very good at that sort of thing.
Yes, I'm familiar with Scrivener.
Notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used some of them early on, but I just didn't quite click, so I just went back to pen and paper. But they had a lot of good tools, especially, like, really good for keeping notes on characters and worlds and maps, and lots of tools for, like, sorting and, like, organizing that information. But I generally kind of start with an idea. I tend to, like, work on premises, like, what is interesting about this world to start with. Let's talk, like, a Direction's Tale. It's a middle grade epic fantasy I wrote. It was on the list of things. Where I got my thought there was I very much kind of hit the concept of taking, a traditional, very simplistic fantasy world, like, literally, like, the kingdom, there is a kingdom of the sun and, like, a kingdom of the moon. One is day and one is night. But then take that simplistic concept and then kind of go deeper in how would this come about and how do these people actually live? And then kind of roll from there. So because I'm thinking about, it's probably religious. So I actually started with, like, the religions and then worked the religions out into how it affected because they're both kind of ecclesiarchies, kingdoms essentially run by the priesthoods. Then that, you know, then how all those beliefs and how that then shaped the secular people. And then once I kind of had that framework, a lot of people forget that fantasy, that all worlds have, like, you can do a lot of world building with simple things like figures of speech and expressions and how people curse, how people tell
Yes.
time, you know, because how people measure distance, weird little things. But if you throw those in there, they just make you feel like the world is lived in, right?
Frack, yes. I love Jamie.
Yep. Hey, there's nothing wrong with cheating like that. Inspiration thing with maps is powerful. I mean, not Pern. The Xanth novels, Piers Anthony. They're just fantasy Florida, literally. He just took Florida, made it fantasy, and that's just.
Yeah, world building can be anything. It can be fantasy Florida.
Yep, it can be fantasy Florida.
You shared some like cool world building details from some of your works, and you talked about some of the tools that you use. What do you find is your like biggest challenge when world building?
You know, the biggest challenge in world building is comes down to, honestly, communicating it in a good way, to the reader.
Yes.
Without, there's so many things that can go wrong with exposition and communicating world building. A lot of writers, and I'm one of them, sometimes you get that point where you want to tell the reader about everything. And you want to tell them about it as soon as possible because it's so cool, right? You did all this work and this is amazing. You have all these cool things in your head about this world. But if you do that, obviously that doesn't work. It's very boring. You just wrote a history textbook for a fantasy world. Nobody wants that.
Yeah.
So a lot of it's coming out interesting ways to tell exposition and getting the essential details that the reader needs to understand the story without shattering the pacing or making the reader bored or making them tune out or being unrealistic about it, because not everyone in the world knows everything about the world. So
exactly,
it's a lot of it's keeping a lot of plate spinning, I think. And that could be anywhere from just parsing out information to a classic, your main character, the main protagonist, knowing nothing about what's going on and needing to be told at intervals.
Yes.
Another one, it's going to be in Songs and Sorcery, my next book after the one currently coming out. It's an epistology, which means it's a novel that's told through documents.
Through documents and letters.
Right. Wow. So there are character journals, but what I did to help with the exposition, because there's a lot of moving parts in this world, is there's literally sometimes because it takes in a vast magical city it's literally called just the Walled City. It's 5 cities stacked on top of each other. And obviously a place like that, they have guidebooks. So there's occasional snippets from the guidebook to the Walled City, or snippets from textbooks or history books, just a little bit to add context when needed, when the characters who have their own things going on would have no reason to give context. So it naturally sort of feeds in while feeling natural, diegetic, to use a fancy word for it.
There we go.
Yeah, I've been to school. Yeah. So yeah, it's on finding interesting ways to get to feed that information. It's the biggest challenge for me.
Yeah, I agree. You don't want to do too much telling versus showing, or vice versa, to be honest. You need to find that balance of things. You can have a little expedition, but don't go crazy with it unless that's something that you've kind of established. I know some genres are a little bit more exposition heavy than others, and epic fantasy is kind of one of those. But I like to find that balance for sure, but it can be really challenging, like especially when, like you said, when there's like some sort of juicy detail that you really want to reveal. But you kind of have to let your characters like experience it like in real time as they run into that, you know.
Absolutely.
Like for instance, in one of my stories, you know, marriage rituals become a big part of the story near the end of my second book. And some of my beta readers were like, ooh, I want to know more about this. Why do they do this? Why do they do that? And I was like, well, I can't really like fully explain that in the context because these characters know about it already. So I can't go into like huge detail. I'm just kind of giving like some flavor text a little bit, you know? You don't want to over explain things too much, especially when it comes to like magic, because
magic used to have wonder.
Yes, if once you start over explaining magic, it becomes less interesting, in my opinion.
Apologies to all the Brandon Sanderson fans in the audience.
And I have read, you know, some of the Wheel of Time books and some of Brandon Sanderson's work. So I do appreciate that on occasion, and like I said, but finding that balance is super important. We had one question in the chat from Jay Payne. They ask, so any genre that you want to get into, such as cosmic horror or others?
You know, that's a good question. One thing I will say is I don't restrict myself on genre, even though there's only one genre that I feel like I need to separate, and that is going too deep, to going heavily into pure romance, because especially if you get spicy, you kind of have to create a separation for professional reasons, because you don't want, let's say you're like me and have some middle grade books. You don't want a middle grader accidentally getting shuffled by Amazon into spicy romance. But honestly, there's no genre I want to limit myself from. I would, one day I would like to actually try to explore some horror, because I like horror, but I've never tried writing it, and that would be an interesting challenge. Clearly, I read a lot of Stephen King, but I still like horror. I'd like to explore it sometime, but that'd be something. But I there's nothing I'm specifically targeting, but everything I would want to try.
Yeah, I agree. I primarily write fantasy and romance, heavy on the romance. And
do you love me romance?
My romance are on more of the spicy side. And I have thoughts like, oh, well, what if I wanted to write, you know, young adult novels or something like that? I would have to probably write under a separate pen name, because some of the stuff I write is not young adult subject matter. And I would have to create that separation. But I also have a sci-fi series kind of like percolating in the back of my mind. That would be the first time I've ever written sci-fi, even though I am a huge Trekkie. I love Star Wars, so that's more fantasy, honestly, than sci-fi. But I want to try my hand at sci-fi at some point. I am interested in horror in that I love like thrillers, but I'm someone who cannot stomach the jump scares. Someone who has played, you know, like Reku or Chaton, who's played horror games with me, knows that I am a huge wuss when it comes to anything scary. So I am curious what it would be like to write horror, but I find it quite intimidating.
You'd be writing the horrors, not living them.
That's true. I would have more control, so maybe I should try it. That might be a good kind of experiment. Reku says, thank you for your service at horror games. We have one other question from Mint K. Lindy. They ask, do you ever get into a conflict of world building, plot versus character motivation and agency? Like the need for a plot point, but the character wouldn't ever do the thing that needs to move the plot forward.
I don't see me rubbing my hands together. This is a good one.
Oh, this is a good one.
It's a good one. Yes, sometimes, but here is my take on that. Here's my philosophy. Some people are different. I am ultimately consider myself a character-driven writer. And that is
Same.
Yeah, I set up this great fantasy world and all that, and I set up the characters, and they have their reasons for doing what they're doing, and that's it. But once they get going, I would be considered like a plantser. Like I'm a little plotter and a little pantser, to where I know where I'd like them to go. But once they get going, things happen.
Yeah.
Because like you could think something out, and then yet the characters will like hit a thing and the bounce off, and stuff happens.
Yes.
And then you just kind of have to, for me, just adapt. Just adapt.
Yeah, exactly. My books are heavily character focused. That's where I start. It starts with character for me. I enjoy world building, but the worlds are built around the characters for me personally. And that's really where it starts. The characters are what are driving the story. So you have to be very mindful and careful about creating motivations for your character and reasons behind the things that they do. And particularly when you're writing romance, it's all about emotion. You have to be able to show what your character is thinking, what they're feeling, without it being, too schmaltzy, and kind of balance that with their motivation for like where they want to go in their life, and the plot takes them there eventually.
Yeah.
But
absolutely agree.
There's always that, like Henry said, that resisting the call to adventure. That's part of every hero's journey, right?
That can be fun sometimes, just
Exactly.
to see having a character go like, I'm going to go there, and then see what happens with that. But I think ultimately, some people though are plot-based writers. They're really big on their plots, and in that case, well, maybe they work a different way than we do.
Yes.
But I still like, between you and Sparrow and the audience, between all of us. No. Character writing is everything
key.
else. Character is key.
Yes. We have another question from Henry. They say, speaking of horror, how do you balance the physical versus emotional vulnerabilities of your character? And I can kind of speak on that, not exactly from a horror angle, but from a writing romance angle, because this is a huge part. Your characters have to be a little bit vulnerable to open up to someone, because that's the horror of falling in love, is opening yourself up to another person. And that can be, frankly, terrifying. So while not exactly horror, that is something that I very specifically try to keep in mind. You have to balance that like emotional vulnerability with crazy fantasy antics, like if a supervillain is trying to tear their guts out, or a monster is coming up from a, bloody summoning circle. I do have some horror elements now that I'm thinking about it in my books.
Aha! The truth is revealed.
It is. But what about you, JB?
I absolutely, again, we're weirdly, it seems as if we're on a wavelength and moving in lockstep. But yes, I think judging by how you answer that question, Henry, I think you're also talking you are talking in general. I think that is an important thing to look at. I think it is important that characters, no matter how powerful, quote unquote, they might be, need to have vulnerabilities, and not just in the terms of like, Superman being vulnerable to kryptonite. We'll use the big classic. But which is still a vulnerability. It's a physical vulnerability, but the characters have to be vulnerable because you have to have stakes. Even if they're the little stakes of like, will Jenny ask me to the prom? That's a stake. That's really important.
High stakes.
It's those stakes are important. So like, you have to create those vulnerabilities, but at the same time, like, there is a balance, because if you make them totally vulnerable, like completely emotional wet rags, and people like characters with little like guts, a little something. I don't want to say spine, because there's some utterly adorable spineless wimps in fiction, but there's got to be a heart that moves them forward.
Seeing them move past those things are what make them compelling.
Right. Exactly. And I'm also going to throw a counterbalance. It can be interesting to play with strength as vulnerability.
I think we're actually diving into our next topic, which is characters and creatures. We've kind of already moved into this topic.
New title: characters and creatures.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk about a situation from a project that is secret and I cannot acknowledge.
Ooh.
But I have written it, and it's what I'm currently working on. But I cannot say for if you know, you know, and if you could read, it's got to do with something I'm working on. I can't talk, but anyway, I can talk about aspects of it.
Gotcha.
And that is this. So in one of the character aspects in this thing that in this project is that there's a character. This is more like superhero, supervillain fiction. There's a character that she is quite literally invulnerable. So you think that's a very powerful physical bonus, but that is also looking at the further aspects of how that kind of life is. There is downsides to that and interesting ways you could play on that vulnerability, vulnerable and vulnerability, because there's a lot of aspects of life that are like, if you think about how life is, not being able to pain, minimal sensations, because like hot and cold are kind of based on hurt and things. That's like true. That. There is different sensations. The world's a different place. And there's the problem of, if you're invulnerable, what about people that you love? It's a kind of a classic superhero conundrum in general, but it is always a classic. It's, you may be impervious to problems, but what about everyone else in your life? Actually, the best way people argue about how to write a good Superman story, that's the story. It's not the physical invulnerability of Superman. It's the emotion. It is the problems of being that powerful while also being a good person, and the emotional vulnerabilities of being a good, responsible person while having all of this power.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's something that I was recently thinking about because we've been watching the new X-Men animated show, X-Men 97, and revisiting some of the older movies because my son hasn't seen them. And the character of Wolverine is this, he's basically invulnerable, but he can't age. He can't get drunk. He finds issues being, emotionally vulnerable, even though his body is physically invulnerable. Yep. It's really interesting dichotomy to play with for a character.
Yeah. And that's a thing you can play with. You can do a lot of different things that sometimes you can. So I would always suggest as a writer, hey, if you're looking at trying how to make your characters vulnerable and emotionally interesting, maybe you play on their strengths. It's a different way to look at it that a lot of people overlook.
Yeah, one of the protagonists of my series is one of his main defining traits is he's an incredibly great mage. He is extremely powerful, but the thing is, everyone is after him because of that power. They want to marry him off to a rich family, but he doesn't want to get married. People are trying to kill him because he is extremely powerful. So having power, having that strength is a huge crux of the story because he's trying to run away from that power. The Highlander curse, exactly. You get to live forever and watch everyone grow old and die. That's another thing, with writing vampire kind of characters or elven characters. They get old, they see the people that they love die and pass away, and how does that influence someone emotionally?
Watch for your end.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
Watch for your end.
Watch for your end. Journey's End. Extremely great anime.
It is. I can't believe I didn't think of that to tell you, to mention some influence, because it's one episode I'm like, mwah, chef's kiss.
Yes, exactly. I think it's about time for us to take a quick break.
It's been an hour. Wow, it's been an hour already.
Yeah, I know. Christmas. We've been chatting for a long time. So let's give everyone just about 5 minutes to go grab a drink, stretch their backs, and we will be back and continue chatting more about characters and creatures. We will be right back, everyone. All right, everyone, we are back. I hope you took an opportunity to grab a drink, stretch your legs, and hit the restroom, because we are ready to dive back into our discussion. Starting again on the characters and creatures, we had a question from Henry, and they ask, would you rather have a protag-kun, a hidden prince who was born into his powers, or just one of us who saw the need and stepped once more into the breach?
Ooh, that's a good one, and because I like to do both.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
honestly,
That's what
right?
my answer was going to be, is a little bit of both.
Yeah, I have to I've done both, and I like it. Kind of depends on the story I want to tell, right? Because they're two very different stories, but they're both good stories. So it's like, very much depends. I don't have a preference on that one.
Yeah, me either. I kind of have a little of column A, a little of column B, maybe more of the hidden prince, kind of literally in one of my stories. But I think there's also, huge value in, seeing the little man rise up and change the world for sure. Everybody loves an underdog.
Amen.
So diving into a little bit more about how you create your characters. To you, JB, what makes for a good hero, heroine, protagonist, protag-kun, or Chan?
Yeah, our protag peoples. Well, I think one of the most important things about a protagonist is they have to an agency. There has to be something in them that drives them to do a thing. Whether that is created by the story, like in the early chapters, or something that's just an elemental part of their character. Because a protagonist that does nothing is boring.
Yeah.
Same thing of antagonists that do nothing. But
Yes.
I think past that, I am kind of, and this isn't me, this is not a rule. I am a sucker for good people. I don't often like to do shady protagonists. Sometimes, but so I tend towards being pretty actually good people. I think not just because I like it, but there is something to good people have usually more interesting choices to make, I feel. Because okay, now this is not all villains. Hashtag not all villains. But if villains that lack moral fiber, and quite a few of them do, it's easy to make choices when you're not really worried about other people and the consequences of your actions outside of how they affect you. Someone that's a good in the sense of that they care about other people and are responsible with their actions and try to take care of others in the world around them. That's a lot. Again, that's a lot of interesting limiters and a lot of hard choices. And you get trolley problems aplenty, sure. But at the same time, it gives room for I especially think it's great to have a smart character that is good.
Instead of the himbo type.
No, I like me some thembos. I mean, I have a couple. I have some of those in my lineups of main characters, but having a character that is smart and having to approach complicated moral issues and being a good person, I think can be interesting because you can sometimes cut through certain logical fallacies and like the trolley problem. You outthink it. You don't have to interesting to find new ways of dealing with normal problems that protagonists might face in the course of being a good, decent human being.
That's really interesting because for me, whenever I play a video game that gives you moral choices, I have Baldur's Gate up in the background, the character creator, since we're talking about creating characters. I can't stand to pick the evil options in games. I don't want to hurt virtual people's feelings. Yeah. It's a huge push for me to be evil inherently as myself. I'm a people pleaser, I'm a goody two shoes in real life, but when it comes to creating characters in my books, I actually like the slightly evil, slightly selfish, slightly self-centered kind of characters. That's kind of where several of my characters start, because I find that it makes like a really interesting journey for them to go on to kind of like, oh, I need to learn how to care about other people or I'm going to be alone, basically. And it creates this really great character arc, because we see this character who has the potential to be a villain choose good in the end. And I think that's really compelling. And also, it's really fun to write mean, snarky dialogue.
You're not wrong, and you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right in that. Everyone loves a good redemption arc.
Yes.
But you know what? You actually just reminded me, I think, the most important thing about a protagonist. Protagonists need to have character arcs.
Yes.
Which you think would be obvious. They're characters in the book that have character arcs, but I mean, it is so easy to accidentally write yourself in a corner where it's a flat character. It doesn't really go anywhere. And that's part of the agency and all, but like a character, if your protagonist does not change, learn a lesson, become something different, even be a better person or a worse person, if something doesn't change they don't go through that transformation over the book, then they're not a good protagonist.
Yes, totally agree. So kind of on that vein, what would you say makes a good villain or antagonist?
I feel there's two great kinds of antagonists, in my opinion. Number one, the villain that we understand, that we know they have clear motivations. You can even sympathize with you may sympathize even with them a lot. Don't wreck you. Hot is good for an antagonist, but it's not essential, okay? She's hot.
Depends on what genre you're writing.
Well, yeah, it could be a big bonus.
Yes.
But seriously, back to semi-serious anyway. A good fleshed out villain, that's also a good one, with conviction, who has not been convicted yet. But yeah, villains that have motivation and conviction and have understandable reasons for doing what they're doing, that you can go, you know what, if I were in their shoes, I might do that. That's number one, I think, of great villains. Number two is the villain that is just evil and loves it. Just like
reveling in it.
Or just love being evil. They just wake up in morning, put on their evil pants, put on their evil shirt, eat their evil breakfast, and be like, I'm going to go do some evil. Is there a henchman I have? Do we have a henchman I can shoot? Because I'd love to do that. It'd be a great way to start my morning. Because there's something about that that's just, sometimes I feel like it's, I just want a mustache twirling, evil person. Just love, and they have to love it. If they're conflicted about it, then they need to be part one. They need to be in section one and give them good motivations and everything. But a good number two villain is just, it's got no tragic backstory. It's just, I'm here to be, I love being evil.
Yeah, striking that balance, and depending on what genre you're writing,
that does matter.
It really does matter. Are you writing a super serious drama fantasy, or are you writing a lighthearted, fantasy YA? You kind of have to keep those in your mind when you're writing either a hero or a villain, but particularly the villains, because you can go extremely dark if you want to.
Oh yeah. And sometimes it's really interesting to explore the really dark things, like go all the way and see where it takes you, because it's something that exists in real life, and fantasy can be a really good lens at looking at difficult and complicated real world things in a safe environment where it's not going to mess with anything, and we can believe whatever we want. And that especially goes for romance. Like there are so many things that are totally fine in romance that would never fly in real life.
Very true.
But we explore them because we have those feelings, and it gives us a safe way to explore things like dubcon and non-con and all sorts of things that we're normally not allowed to do.
Yeah, and you do need to be careful with those topics, but like you said, it's a safe space, for people to explore and feel. Similar to horror, you are feeling that feeling of terror, of horror, in this safe environment where you can close the book and put it away if you want to, or you can pick it back up, read through it, and you have accomplished something. You're stronger because you got through this story. You feel that sense of like accomplishment and relief. And
catharsis.
Yes, catharsis, exactly. Henry has another great question for us. He says, have you been more successful with characters who reflect aspects of yourself, or those that have been inspired by what you have read or experienced in real life? I wonder what that person is waiting for there, or what would they do in a situation X. For me, I mean, I get a certain joy about writing characters that are very different from myself, just because in some ways it's living vicariously through my characters. But another way, it's exploring another aspect of myself that I don't get to openly express. I work in a corporate environment. I can't, snark back when a client asks me to do something unbelievably annoying. But I can imagine my character saying it to them. But at the heart of them, my characters are generally good guys. So I think you like in anything with writing, you have to find that balance. But what would you say, JB?
I'll be honest, when it comes to like all of my protagonists, and I have spent many hours in therapy talking about this. All of my protagonists are they're not me 100%, sometimes not even like 50%, but there is an important elemental aspect of myself in every single protagonist I've ever written, and the trend continues.
Yeah.
I explore, and I think honestly, like I once wrote a book and put it before my editor, and she read it and said, "This is really good, but you realize this is a therapy book." That's the day I learned the term therapy book.
Oh, interesting.
And we writers often, not all of us, but some of us, a lot of us do write out important things that we're working through ourselves, become like the inspiration for a book. So yeah, I'm really much more of the one. I've never I know elements of like people I meet and fragments of those do wind up in characters as well. Like they tend to be more secondary characters, but my protagonists are purely drawn from what's going on up in my brain.
I think that's a great place to start. And I think every author, it comes from somewhere in yourself, It may start as your story, but it becomes, something else entirely. And I think that's the amazing power of creativity and writing and, feeling your feelings through other characters. That's why I write, at least.
100%. 100%. And I also love it. What I really find fascinating is when something you've put out in the world and people read, and then they start thinking and talking about and conjecturing. And I mean, fanfic is the ultimate expression of that, but just start riffing on what you created and seeing it different ways and reinterpreting it. And it becomes this sort of generative, creative spiral that it adds something to the world. If I'm going to sound real sappy, art adds something to the world, and that is how our writing adds to the world.
I agree. So we primarily, or at least I primarily write fantasy. I know you write all kinds of different genres. But I want to talk a little bit about like fantastical creatures and characters and powers, magic in our books. Like, what are some of your favorite like fantasy creatures?
Okay, so this is where A Direction's Tale. We talked about that earlier. That is like, if I have a thing that was like me trying to go maximum third eye, 7 chakras open, super creativity, that's the book. Because I really wanted to create a fantasy world that did not, it had inspiration. Because all fantasy, you're inspired by all this stuff, but like truly felt like a creation of my own. With as little inspiration as I can without like making it not seem without still being fantasy. And so, I was talking about how like I did this dichotomous world and these creatures like on the front cover, even it doesn't look that, but like the attraction is, and all of the various species of this world are all like, they're sentient creatures, but they're creatures. And I kind of, because I started with like this philosophy and like how like the how these two like absolute kind of distant divinities influenced life on this little planet. Everything in there is like, they're kind of my favorites because they're everything that I crafted myself. Like, kind of started from the aspect like, oh, well, if, obviously life and death are a cycle. So, how does being connected to something, being so close to something that is death, but also tied into the cycle of life and death, how does it affect like this species? And how does being connected to light and the sun affect this species? And so there's kind of like in that world in Toronto, there's this sliding scale from like the Drechen, which are like the things closest to death, which is like our main character, actually. She's a little Drechen girl. Drechens are like, they seem to be very nasty, they were like claws and fangs and all this. But we find out over the course of the story that like, there's a lot more to it than that. They represent death in a very simple aspect of how they are like kind of, they seem to be rapacious and wild and all these things, but they're part of the cycle of life and death, and because of they're also very short lifespans. While the closer you are to like the life side, they have very long lifespans. If humans kind of begin in the middle. So, but however, because of the cycle of life and death and how their society works, like they have like ancestral memories, and so they mature very quickly, and they sort of remember things from have sort of ancestral memory that they draw upon, so they mature very quickly. And while it's the opposite on the other end, and like the greater things are close to life, they don't like they're herbivores. They're like giant metallic herbivores. They have like deer teeth.
Whoa. And
they're very strange in that regard to like humans. And humans are this weird in between place where they can go on either side. And there's a lot to it, but like I really liked the characters I invented, the creatures I invented in that world, because they're the things that are most indicative of me just being flat out uniquely creative, as opposed to leaning heavily on other classic fantasy inspirations.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you came up with your own kind of like fantasy races and creatures versus going into like, the Dungeons and Dragons kind of characters.
Yes. I lean a lot on that in like other fantasy stuff, in my other fantasies. So like this was my chance to really like flex the creative muscle, so to speak.
Yeah,
I keep gesturing, and I know no one can see me gesture.
Yeah, that's the problem with this kind of medium.
Oh, but it's fun. It's fun. I would be doing this, and yeah, I just have to remember. It's just can't.
Like I love classic sword and sorcery, Dungeons and Dragons inspired creatures. I haven't had a chance to write like a really like with lots of like fantastical creatures yet. I have something planned that I'm in the process of writing more. In particular, I love kind of like the mishmash of like different creatures that kind of come apart. I love griffins in particular. I'm looking forward to writing a griffin in one of my upcoming books, which is like
Griffins don't get the respect they're due. Honestly, they're really interesting.
Yeah, and I love them because they're like part cat, so you get like kind of the cat kind of behaviors, but they can also fly. And I always loved the Cat Wings books as a child. I don't know, the idea of a flying cat kind of creature always, I don't know, it just felt so cool to me. So I'm really looking to kind of stretch my fantasy muscles with that into my next series.
Looking forward to it then.
Yes. Well, let's dive into our next topic, which we've already kind of broached into quite a bit based off our others, which is romance and fantasy, which is like a huge, very popular genre nowadays, romantasy, as they call it.
Oh, good. I'm glad you said it, because it hurts my tongue every time I say romantasy. It just feels weird. It's a portmanteau that doesn't really work for me, but
it's kind of a buzzword, so I've embraced it just because I know it's something that will bring me readers, but
absolutely.
It is a little bit of an awkward term for sure. But
it's good. Romance plus fantasy. Mwah, chef's kiss.
Yes, for me, I I would say that my books are romance in fantasy settings versus fantasy stories with romantic aspects. Like my stories lean heavily into, some romantic tropes, beats that people are kind of expecting from a romance genre, with a lot of fantasy trappings around it. But for you, JB, how do you balance epic scope of a fantasy with like romantic subplots without like overshadowing one or the other?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, because I am definitely more balanced. Like I almost always incorporate romance because I love romance into my fantasies, but they're subplot, not main plot. So it's hard. It can be hard to balance it. I think the important thing is to remember. I think one of the things, and this actually kind of comes with pacing too, is to case both of the like that main epic fantasy plot and the romance subplot you've got going on, and make sure that both are evenly paced. Because you're building this big, you're building the big action tension in the big fantasy. You can hit the romantic subplots like when you get some catharsis from those, like when you get like peaks, and then maybe like in the denouement of like big action moment, then maybe you can interject some romance moments and sort of build on that. I think you can also integrate the two to a degree, and I think a lot of people do. This is just kind of seems it's a second nature, at least it seems to me. But just have it said, remember these characters. If you have two characters that have this romantic plot, they have this tension going on, they've got this will they, won't they, or whatnot. If they're in an action scene together, you always have to remember that, because that will change the action scene. And in a way, you can kind of do the two at the same time, where you could build romantic tension and set up the subplot because of what happens in the action scene between the two characters, or what happens to one of the characters as a result of the like epic fantasy action scene.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of give an example from one of mine, and I'm sure you're going to have some good examples too. Gonasteer's got one of the major like secondary subplots. It actually kind of gets close to romantasy and to like an even split at points. Is two of our main characters, they're childhood friends that have feelings for each other, and they've been thrust back together after years apart. But because they are forced also to be going on this quest at the same time, the elements of what happens to each of them over it, and how they grow as characters, not just from the romance, but from like the quest itself they're going on, creates extra romantic subplot points that bounce off each other and inform their decisions, and complete even after their relationship is consummated. It's also not the end of the romance that bleeds on into the big finale. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You have to find that kind of like cadence of you're hitting, at least for me, hitting romance beats, hitting fantasy beats, hitting overall like plot beats in like an even succession, because you don't want to go too deep into one or the other when you're doing a blend of the genres. Like you got your romance in my fantasy, like peanut butter and chocolate, they go together. Just what J Payne said. And Mindy asked, or excuse me, Mint K Lindy, sorry I called you Mindy. What is the difference between romantasy versus romance in fiction that would never happen, like space operas or superheroes? I think it's kind of like a new buzzword. So I think right now romantasy, at least, is mostly like fantasy with heavy romance aspects. Here's some popular ones right now. I've read several of these. Bromance, a little different than bromance, though I enjoy queer romance myself. So there's definitely some of that. I don't know. What would you say? What would you say the difference is?
Oh, it's a toughie, because I'm going to give an answer that seems very dismissive of romantasy, but it's not meant to. So let me predicate with that. I think the only difference between romantasy and other like genre fiction that's written romance heavy is buzzword. It's ultimately no different, in my opinion. I'm gonna
Yeah.
like if you do a heavy romance like superhero story, it would be there's no convenient portmanteau buzzword to call it, but it shares a lot of the same. It shares the same plot structure and plot beats as a romantasy would in a way, because it is romance that's adding genre fiction conventions to it. So you do the romance first, and then you would add the superhero or space opera aspects to fit both genres and make it all feel like a complete whole.
Yeah, exactly. And Henry asks, so romance outside of physical aspects, question mark, such as a knightly courtly love between a princess and her sapient dragon steed. Well, I know that the whole monster lover subgenre. I'm not sure what our audience is like tonight, so I will keep it somewhat family friendly.
Yeah, we'll keep it somewhat PG. Yeah, PG-13.
That is a very popular genre in the romance community at the moment. Any kind of monster lead characters as being a direct romance lead is really interesting, and something that I've explored a little bit in my work. Kind of in the more of like the werewolf kind of demon kind of thing is one of my main characters, kind of. That is definitely part of it. But talking about the like physical aspects, in romance, usually there are love scenes, depending on, how spicy or not. So a physical aspect, even if you're just talking about physical touch and not necessarily, going to bed with each other, that is a huge aspect of writing romance, unless you're writing like ace romance. But for the most part, it's something you need to be cognizant of when you're writing. Using those senses to explore physical intimacy is a huge challenge, but something that can be extremely rewarding and very powerful in romance writing.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to separate physical aspects from romantic physicality and sexual physicality. Because especially because you mentioned ace, I think this is an important thing. Like, I think you could, because like you can totally do like an ace romance where like they're still going to touch each other, but they're not going to have sex. And you can have romantic intimacy without physical intimacy. Now, will that sell? It's going to have a niche market.
Yeah.
But that's one thing. Sometimes we have to make allowances as writers, even when we have a really interesting idea. You make a few, not huge, I don't like to make big concessions, but you'll sometimes have to make a few minor concessions. Romance, unless you're specifically writing to like that specific sub niche of romance that doesn't deal with like actual sex. I have to deal with it now. I personally would partially find a novel about a knightly courtly love between a princess and her sapient dragon steed awesome. I actually did that sort of in a role-playing game once. I was playing, it was a very long game where I was playing a very prim and proper kobold paladin, and she was very and she got interested in the like paladin queen of the nation, and she did full courtly love because someone told her that like, oh, this is a very honorable and ordered way to woo someone, and you're not physically compatible. She's a human, you're a kobold, but if you do it like this, here's all the rules of courtly romance, have at it. And that was a very interesting love story to play out. So it could be a very interesting love story to read, but now as a romantic subplot to an epic fantasy, I don't think you do a full romance, but a romantic subplot to an epic fantasy, I think that would be actually pretty amazing. To have something that's predicated purely on this very pure romance that has no like sexual aspect.
Well, I think, traditional, like old school romance, a lot of that what it was is somewhat chaste up until like the very end when maybe the relationship is consummated. But for the most part, there's a slow build of romantic aspects up into a physical and literal climax. And But, nowadays you can do it however you want. For instance, in my books, there is a lust first, love later kind of aspect to it. It's like, okay, I'm super into you, but yeah, maybe we'll sleep together. But oh wait, I caught feelings.
Whoops. It's dangerous feelings.
Dangerous.
And that's actually I like that you do that, because you can have both. You can have that old school romance, but I think being able to tell a variety of romantic stories is something we're finally getting to embrace in this modern time. And not people have told these stories. Let me be clear. People have told these kind of stories throughout history, but to have it more mainstream acceptance, that you can write it and people will instantly go, "That is porn," and slap it in a vault, or that's just improper. It's improper romance, young lady.
Yeah, no, romance can be so many things nowadays. You can write basically whatever you want. I mean, you have to be careful about certain things, especially if you're going to be published on, traditionally published, or if you're going to be on large platforms such as like Amazon. There's definitely things that they will boot you off for, I will say. But for the most part, people are much more freely writing, for instance, like queer romance nowadays than ever before. And I think that's super exciting. And I'm so excited to read more.
Oh yeah.
And write more.
Amen to that. But yeah, I think we are getting a lot of that openness that we didn't have in exploring romantic themes in any genre, but just in pure romance. Like, you could get away with a lot on Amazon nowadays. I mean, there is an erotic category for a reason.
That's very, very, very true.
It's just make sure don't put it on the cover. They don't like that.
Yeah, you can't put full on going at it on the cover.
Yes, no naked, no naked. Just tasteful sexiness.
Henry asks, skipping the question about how fantasy can bend the rules of our world in romance, especially WRT, an author whose name must not be said. How can fantasy bend the rules of our world? I mean, fantasy and romance in general, bending the rules is kind of part and parcel of writing in the genre. If you wanted to write something that was straight up normie, you wouldn't be writing fantasy.
I think, and I think you could. I think one of the things that's fun about writing things like romantasy and any kind of genre fiction combined with romance is playing with the fantastical aspects and how they integrate specifically with how, like, romance and love are in that world. Like, how does magic affect things like dating? How does it affect, like, the cultures of, the institutions of marriage and partnerships, and how does it, and even to the point of how does it alter sex and lovemaking and and child.
Yeah, for example, main couple are kept apart by their control freak desires to use magic to mind control the other. Interesting.
Ooh, that's kinky.
I think there's definitely an audience out there for that.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, 1,000%.
Yeah.
Control
in general is a huge thing in romance, because it has everything to do with what I mentioned earlier about vulnerability, because being vulnerable to another person, emotionally, physically, has a dangerous aspect to it, and it can be shattering. It can be scary, but it can also be so, like, rewarding. But to kind of get there, it can be challenging.
Right, and I think, kind of riffing off the specific example you gave, Henry, like, that is the ultimate, like, discussion of control and trust. Especially if they both know they can do it. So you have two people who are falling for each other, who know that they could mentally control each other, but they're still going to be, like, drawn together. And how do they how do they work that out? How do they like find some magical way? A specific thing will block mind control, like this magic ring of like mental fortitude, and we need to get, if we get a match pair of those, then we know what we're feeling is honest because we can't control each other, or something like that. There's a lot of ways you could resolve it, but like that's a very good example of using the fantastical elements to add a bend on the story and the romance itself.
Yeah, definitely. It could be a huge part of character building as well as just the romantic subplot. Well, I think we are getting close to the end, but in conclusion, I wanted to talk about just in general, like what it's like to live as an author. And particular, JB, I know you said you recently have gone completely freelance and are a full-time author and editor. So what is life like as a full-time writer and editor?
Ooh, okay. So I'm going to start with the most important thing I can say to anyone considering a career as a full-time writer, that you want novelist or author to be your job title. You need to think it through very, very carefully. This is the most fulfilling and job I have ever had. Writing is the greatest thing in my life, and if I could not write, I would be devastated. I literally yesterday, I was asked by my therapist, well, what is the thing that like you value most, the thing that you use as a barometer of whether you're happy or not? What makes your life fulfilling? I'm like, the writing. If I don't write in a day, or I don't like can think about writing, or I'm not like doing something, it's a bad day. However, honestly, being an author is fiscally very unfulfilling.
Physically, or fiscally,
fiscally, monies, the moonies.
Yeah,
There's a lot of unfortunately, art of any kind is still not really well respected, at least in terms of paying for it. A lot of people like to get things for free, and they don't value the time and energy that goes into writing. It's just the truth of it is, if you're an indie author, you have to put basically, you're responsible for everything. So that's a tremendous amount of work to do, because you're not only writing, but you've got to market, you've got to social media, you've got to plan the next things, you have to coordinate, you got to find an editor, you got to find an artist. Yeah, Sparrow's like, oh yeah,
it's a lot.
And then you could try to go traditional publishing, but then traditional publishing has the difficulties of, there is no easy access point. It's like this is a giant fortress. Now you can try to talk to, like, we'll use a fantasy example. Imagine traditional publishing is like a fortress, a castle with the kings, the heads of the publishing companies. They live in the castle. You're a peasant. You can't get in there. You can't get an audience with the king. But there are courtiers, the landed elite, the agents. You can talk to an agent and go, hey, look at my book, tell me it's pretty. Most of them will not. And because there's many writers, many peasants trying to see the king. There's lots of these little nobles, but they're all crowded by hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. So you have to hope that they look at your book, hope that they like your book. Then if they like your book, then they will go into the castle and start talking with the publishers. And it is a time-intensive process.
It really is.
It can be years, and that's if things go well. And all this other time, you are starving. Now, there's a middle ground, that's small presses, which both Sparrow and I have books published through small presses. Now, of course, they can be faster. They're more agile. They tend to have open submissions. And a good small press will take some of the load off of you. They won't take all of it.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the downside is they don't have the reach of a trad publisher. They don't have your book will not be in most bookstores and things like that. So that's why if you give, and it sounds like I'm really like taking this as a horrible industry, never get involved, and I'm kind of saying
No.
but it is, if you have the urge to write, there is no job that could be more. There's no job that will fulfill you more. Now, what you can do is what a lot of authors do, and that is they're part-time authors. And there's nothing wrong with that. You're still a professional writer, but you do it in your off hours, and then maybe if you're lucky, you do get something that hits big enough to go through. Yes, one is born a writer and can't escape. It's good. It's a good way to say it.
the feudal lords of publishing.
Yes, but it is super fulfilling, though. It's the best job I've ever had. I am considered amongst my peers as a success story because I am managing to keep my head above water with just writing and editing on the side. But it's a difficult thing, but it's very fulfilling.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, and that's why you write. If you write for the money, you're in it for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
I mean, I am just a part-time writer. I am doing this as a side hustle. I'm a full-time artist and designer working in the corporate world. So I don't have as much time as I would like to write. But I'm also supporting my family. I'm the breadwinner. So it's important to me to, maintain that balance. And I would love to go full-time writer, freelance sometimes, but particularly like the marketing aspect of it is extremely challenging. It's really hard to break out there on your own. And even with small publishers, like JB said, they don't even have a lot of resources. I know that the marketing that my small publisher does is fairly minimal. I'm still expected to do a lot of the marketing myself, even though I am working with a publisher. They are a small publisher. They pay for my editor, which is a large expense and definitely worth it. They pay for cover design and formatting of my book. They publish it for me on multiple platforms. And they do some marketing, but it's nothing like a large, traditional publisher. I currently do not have an agent. That's something that I have looked into. I've tried, and I haven't had a lot of success yet. I'm thinking once I have some more books under my belt, I will explore that once again. JB, do you have an agent?
I do not. I tried. I put stuff out there, but it just turned into one of those. It was hard to justify, but again, and someday I have the same feeling as you do. And it's not me. I will find that project that I feel needs to go out there. I'm actually working on something that might. Let's see. My publisher just want to take a look at it, but she's been like, this could be big enough that you want to try to take it to an agent. We'll see. She knows some agents and might be able to help. But even then, even if it's something that is big and interesting, do you want to wait the 4 to 5 years?
It's a long journey to traditional publishing. Even just getting that initial response from even a small publisher can take months to years sometimes, and going through the editing process, because they have dozens or hundreds of authors that they are managing for their publishing business. And they only have a certain number of editors that are editing those books for them because they have a smaller budget. So you have to wait your turn.
You have to wait your turn.
It can be extremely lengthy. And meanwhile, if you were self-publishing, you could have already had that book out there and making money for you, and at a much higher margin. Publishers do take part of the sales that you make, but if you self-publish, you get all that money. But is your book going to be out there to the right audience? Are people going to see it if you self-publish versus otherwise? It's all over the place. Henry asks, what has been your most successful marketing trick to get your work out into the world? And I wish I knew.
Yeah. I will say probably the thing that's helped me the most, and this isn't a trick, this is when I have gotten someone who has more clout and more strokes than me, to use a wrestling term, to see my book and like it and tell people about it.
Yes. Word of
I mean,
mouth is the most powerful
word of cat.
tool. Word of cat. This is my assistant,
Yeah.
Grub.
Aww.
But yeah, making connections, I think, is probably one of the biggest things in building yourself as a writer. 'Cause I'm no good at marketing. I'm no good at social media. I'm getting better a little bit, but it is a huge challenge, and things are always changing. The algorithms are always changing. You know, depending on the platform, you have to do your research, and it's very challenging. Just like, do I use hashtags? Oh no, they don't like hashtags anymore. It's like, how are people going to find me? Who knows? You get RT'd or retweeted by someone big, and then maybe people will come to your stream.
The most important thing when it comes to marketing is one thing I have absorbed through my thick skull over the years is, well, two things. One, most writers are terrible at marketing because we're not built that way. Very few creatives are good at marketing, which is terrible, but that's why we find patrons. The other thing, yes, networking is the only guaranteed way to possibly start to make it. Finding, writers and any kind of person that likes what you're doing and wants to support it, who is more out there than you are, even if it's just a little bit, it builds.
Yeah, for sure. It's incremental, and it can take a long time. And building your audience, sometimes you get lucky, you go viral, and other times you slowly build an audience over years and years. And with writing, I know having a large catalog of books certainly helps, because someone will read one book and then they're like, oh, I really like that. I'm going to go and search this author and buy all the rest of their books. So having a backlog is another thing. And that is a challenge in itself, just doing the work.
Yeah. I would say the one thing that all writers need to have, and it plays into this, is like, we are like 99% fueled by persistence. Like, because you got to finish the book and then you got to finish the next one, and you have to be persistent and stubborn, because you can't look at how well the first book did. Not really, because you'll just be sad, and you just got to keep going because it does build. Sparrow is 100% right, because the more you put out there, it's more chances that you'll find the thing that hooks an audience, but also there's literally readers I know that will not read your series until it's done because they're sadistic, but they also don't want to be burned.
Yeah, so they don't want to be left hanging.
Yeah. So, but that's why you keep going and you create that track record to where people will find the book that they like, and they'll know that you're consistent and that you're going to put more books out. They won't be left hanging. Then you can start to build a fan base, but it takes time.
Yes,
unless
definitely.
You're super lucky.
Yes, the George R.R. Martin effect, exactly. There's so many fantasy authors that have started a series and then they've just like fallen off the face of the earth. I shouldn't say just fantasy authors. I think it's many different authors, even those that are successful. You have to find that momentum and keep going, and it can be very hard. I know that I have had droughts in between bouts of writing. For me, it's feast or famine around here. Either I'm writing nonstop or I suddenly am stuck for months. And I have to focus on other things in my life. But like I said, I'm part-time. I'm not full-time. So it can be a different world for everyone. But we are running a little bit long, so I will ask one final question to you, JB. Do you have any other advice for new authors looking to write and publish their first book?
Big thing, we've already talked about persistence, that's important, but the big thing I would suggest is finish it, which sounds like dumb, but do not fall into the trap. What I mean by finish it is don't fall into the trap of constantly second guessing and going back and re-editing and rewriting stuff you've done. Everyone's first draft is garbage. And the first draft of your first book is going to be super garbage. But it's not until it is published. It can be as messy as it can be, but when you finish it, that is an important goalpost. You will feel this euphoric sense of like, I did a thing, an accomplishment. Then you can go back and fix it, and you will learn so much over the course of that first book, that first draft, that you'll probably know half the things you need to fix by the end. But if you kept just chewing on it, you would never get to the end to get that full realization to go back and make it right.
Yes, that is excellent advice, and definitely a trap that I fell into in my first book. I was writing it off and on for literal years before I finally was like, hey, I should finally actually finish this. And
it's a common trap.
It is. A common trap. You can go back and forth over the same thing over and over and over again, pick it to death, rewrite it, but just finishing the damn thing, that is amazing. And it's really hard, but it can be done. If I can do it, anybody can do it. I'll say that. It is something that is doable, but it's not without its challenges. All right. Well, I think that takes us to the close. Thank you so much, JB, for joining me today to talk sugar about writing fantasy. I have had an absolute blast chatting with you and all of our chatters here in chat. Thank you all to our fabulous audience for chatting with us tonight. And before we sign off for the evening, do you have any upcoming projects or anything else that you wanted to plug?
Yes. As I said kind of earlier, my first book of Ginger Blue Publishing, Indomitable. It's the first book of the Push Chronicles. It's going to be, it's at least a trilogy, but I could say that it's probably going to be at least 6 books. Perhaps more.
Wow. So get in now.
Get in now. Yeah. It comes out April 30th. You can pre-order now. It's available. I know you could pre-order through Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and I think a couple other outlets. It's going to be a wide release. Ebooks and print books, I think, are more. I think you could pre-order them through Barnes & Noble, and they'll be available day one on Amazon, because Amazon's weird about it. But yeah, that's my next thing. I have a couple more books coming out later this year, but too early to really talk about those. Yeah, check out my website that Sparrow has been so kind to link, because you keep up with things there. But yeah, Indomitable is my next big thing.
Awesome. I am looking forward to it. And you can also follow JB on Facebook and Twitter at JB Garner Writes. So please check out her on those social media platforms. And do you have a topic that you would like for us to chat about? Would you like to be on the show, audience? You can always drop me a line at sparrowbeestreaming, all one word, at gmail.com. And don't forget to hit that follow button or subscribe to make sure you get the notification next time I go live. I really appreciate all the love and support that the channel has gotten so far, and it has been a great help if you would spread the word and help us continue to grow. And you will just you will earn my unending gratitude for that. You can find me here on Twitch, streaming fun conversations and playing chill games, and sometimes not so chill when we try out Phasmophobia or Lethal Company. But you can also find my long form content on YouTube, as well as catch me posting cat pictures and bad video game opinions on various social media platforms. All my links can be found on my linktree at linktr.ee/Sparrowbee. And I will see you next time. Stay sweet, y'all.